Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, greetings everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our second session of our course, What History Class Left Out, Part 1, African History from 10,000 BCE to 711 CE. We're going to jump right into it today because we have a lot to discuss. Our discussion is going to focus on the Nile Valley civilizations of Egypt and Nubia. And that's what we'll be discussing this week and next week. Strap in, we have a lot to discuss. Today's focus will be on Kemet or Egypt or Tameri. These are various names for this nation in Northeast Africa that at its zenith lasted for 3,000 years. When we talk about ancient Egyptian civilization, we're talking about a 3,000-year period of history. Kemet is the name that it was known as, during the time, or Tameri, or the two lands. Egypt is from the Greek Egyptos. So I'll use those terms interchangeably just for the sake of convenience. I know when you hear me talk about Kemet, I'm talking about Egypt. So I'll use Kemet, Egypt. I'm not going to use Tameri so much, but Kemet or Egypt. Talk about the same place. There's a lot of places like that in Africa. When we talk about Nubia, Nubia has three names. Actually four if you want to count modern day Sudan. So Nubia, Nubia, Ethiopia, Kush, and it's now modern day Sudan. So Egypt only has two. Egypt or Kemet, those are the names that I'll use. So we're going to be talking about the Old and the Middle Kingdoms today. Here's our objectives. At the end of this class, you'll be able to understand the importance of the Nile Valley to African history because it is incredibly important. Scholars of African history have made sure that the Nile Valley is not studied outside of African history. And we talked a little bit about that last week. We'll talk more about it today, why that occurred, why particularly Egypt, not even so much Nubia, but Egypt itself has been studied often as part of Western Asian history or even European history. And African historians make sure that, we're not doing that. It's African history. We'll talk about the importance of that. We will talk about the evidence that we have for reconstructing ancient Egyptian history. And this is really where why Egypt has such a prominent place in African history is because we have a lot of evidence, and we're still finding more and more evidence. And we'll talk about the reasons why Egypt was fortunate enough to have its history recorded like that, because it had some advantages that other places in Africa didn't have in terms of its environment. It's a very dry place, so it lends itself to the preservation of written records, the preservation of artwork, and of course, most famously, the preservation of bodies. We talk about mummification and those type of things. So we have rulers and noblemen and women that were mummified in ancient Egypt, whose bodies we still have, whose hair we can still look at, whose skin we can still see. So we have that. We have this preponderance of evidence, is what they call it in legal studies, that we can use to reconstruct ancient Egyptian history. And lastly, we'll talk about some key figures, events, and texts from ancient Egyptian history, particularly focusing on the Old and Middle Kingdoms. So we'll talk about those time periods today. That'll be the basis of our discussion. All right, so where we kind of left off last week, I'm going to do a little bit of overlap from last week because it ties right into our discussion of the Nile Valley. We talked about the emergence of Homo sapiens about 300,000 years ago on the continent of Africa and then spreading out to people the rest of the world. And 300,000 years ago in Africa looked like this. And periodically, Africa goes through climatic shifts. And I'm not talking about the climate change that's man-made, that's human-induced climate change that might ruin us all. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the natural climate change that happens over cycles of thousands of years that the earth goes through, natural climate change. So Africa went from looking like this. Sometimes it was drier, sometimes it was wetter, but around 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, actually, no, the northern part of Africa was going through an exceptionally wet period. So there was a lot more rainfall in places that today are currently desert. And people settled in these places and they grew crops and they had their animals. We talked about those two early formations of human communities. We had pastoralists, people that made their living raising cattle, raising goats, sheep, herding them, and then those people that were agriculturalists that were mastering the techniques for farming. So you got these two types of human organizations. And of course, hunters and gatherers, which were still in the majority of people in Africa, were still hunting and gathering because they were able to sustain themselves doing that. But you did have around 10,000 BCE, the growth of pastoralists and agriculturalists in different parts of the continent. But we're focused on the northeastern part. So, but around 5,000 BCE, things start to look a little bit more familiar to us, where the Sahara really starts to dry up. And when this happens, and when this change affects people throughout North Africa, people go to where the water is. They need the water for their animals, they need the water for their crops. And if the rain isn't falling, you need to move. So what we see around the world during this time, so we talk about 10,000 to 5,000 BCE, we see people moving to the freshwater, to the rivers, and we see the rise of great river civilizations. We see it in Asia, in China, where rivers produce some of the great kingdoms in China. We see it in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, which literally means in between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, where we see some of the earliest human civilizations emerge in that region of the world. And then, of course, we see it in Africa, where African people go to these rivers to sustain themselves. Rivers, lakes, they migrate to Lake Mega-Chad. It was a huge lake in Chad that folks migrated to and they built civilizations around. The River Niger in West Africa, the Niger Delta in West Africa, in Southern Africa along rivers. And of course, in the Congo River Basin, right in the heart of Africa, Africans migrated to these rivers and formed civilizations. The most famous being in the Nile Valley civilization. So I just like to throw this in for two reasons. One is a great poem, and two is a poem by Langston Hughes, and he's an alumnus of Lincoln University, my alma mater. So anytime I can give a shout out to Lincoln University, I always do so. It's the first historically Black college. But anyway, Langston Hughes wrote a great poem in the 1930s called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all gold at sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My heart has grown deep. Rivers are incredibly important to African civilizations. They're important to world civilizations. If you look at major kingdoms around the world, they're usually near rivers because human beings we rely on water. We need it to sustain us, our animals, to sustain our agriculture. They're incredibly important. The Nile Valley is one of the most interesting and prolific rivers in the world. Yeah, and you can see from this map, I should have talked about this before. Look at where these major civilizations are, alongside rivers or lakes. And of course, on the coastal regions as well, because you engage in coastal trade, but this is where civilizations emerge. The bend of the Niger Delta, the Volta River, Lake Chad, and of course the Nile Valley civilizations, which is what we're talking about over the next 2 weeks. So right in that corner of Northeast Africa. In terms of what you can read to follow along if you want to go deeper into this material, the recommended readings. General History of Africa Part 2, I think it's chapters 8 and 9 of what we're dealing with if you're reading this book. History of Africa, all this information is in chapter 2. So the information that we're going to talk about this week and next week are in chapter 2 of the Shillington text. Again, this is the recommended book. I use both in tandem, but this one I would recommend if you just want to follow along, you want something that's easy to follow along with. Chapter 2, the Shillington text. This is what we're looking at today and what we're looking at next week. So again, I don't work for Kevin Shillington. I don't know Kevin Shillington. I'm only promoting this book because it's actually useful. So don't think I get paid to shill his book, because I don't. All right. Our evidence that we're relying on to reconstruct the history today. And again, I told you, ancient Egypt has a lot of evidence that we can use. It's not bereft of evidence. The written record. Kemet, Egypt was one of the earliest civilizations to develop writing. One of the earliest in the world to develop writing. You have cuneiform writing in Mesopotamia. You have Phoenician, which comes later. You have Meta Necha. Writing in China comes a little bit later on. But Egypt was one of the first places. And the great thing about it is they wrote everywhere. They wrote on papyrus, which we still have, but really the best thing for us, particularly the further we go back into ancient Egyptian history, talking about 3500 BCE, 3000 BCE, they wrote in rock on the walls. It's there. You can read it. You can still read it today. It's there. You can read the inscriptions. You can see what it says. So we have a ton of written evidence. And again, this is one of the reasons why we spend so much time in ancient Egypt, not because it's better or more significant than other parts of the continent, and we'll talk about this in a second. It's because the evidence is there. So in the Congo, as we go back, let me go back to this map. There were civilizations we know from archaeology in the Niger Delta that were contemporaneous with the Nile Valley. The difference is the civilizations that existed in the Niger Delta, that's the tropical region of Africa. It's hard to keep records there. It's hard to preserve bodies in there because it's not the arid climate of Egypt where things will actually preserve. So it's not as if civilization wasn't happening in these places. Currently, and things are always evolving, currently we just don't have the evidence to show what was going on outside of the archaeological evidence. We don't have written records. We don't have oral history that goes that far back. So this is why we're looking at it. Archaeology, of course, and Egypt, Kemet was one of the early places where archaeological practices and techniques were mastered in the 19th century, where archaeology was emerging as an academic discipline. Many of the things that were done and a lot of the mistakes actually that were made while studying ancient Egypt. When Europeans went there, during their colonial days and, or seeing the grandeur of the civilization, they devised the techniques to dig up the things that other people's ancestors created. And they tried these techniques out in Africa before they used them in other places in the world. So archaeology emerges at this time. Late 18th century going into the 19th century. From this archaeological evidence, again, we find a lot. You can unearth temples, unearth tombs, unearth administrative buildings. We can see what people have. We're going to talk about rock art to actually start our class. So there's a lot there. Linguistic evidence. And this is really important to tie ancient Egypt really to the rest of Africa and other parts of Africa. So we got linguistic evidence. Botanical evidence. We could tell what people were growing, how they grew things, the way that they were able to modify their crops in order to get better crop yields. We can see all this through botanical evidence. So there's, again, no shortage of evidence for what was happening 5,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. We got a lot of it. All right. Let's talk about the combination of archaeology, linguistics, and culture. Egypt became incredibly popular in the 19th century for the rest of the world after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. And this is really, really important and really is amazing how things line up, because this was done at the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 1800s. Europeans in Egypt, particularly the Syrians and also the French, Napoleon comes into Egypt as part of his attempt to conquer so many different things, and he brings with him a number of anthropologists and folks, and they're there, of course, digging up. And the antiquity of ancient Egypt has been well known. I mean, you can't be a traveler in the ancient world. You see these pyramids, and you know this is an amazing civilization. And I mean, there's going back to the Greeks, the Romans, the Syrians, all these folks. They couldn't deny the grandeur of Egypt. So it's always been this magical place in the minds of people. But for a couple of centuries, the language of ancient Egypt, the writing of ancient Egypt was lost. No one knew what the Greeks call hieroglyphics, what we call metanetia or beautiful speech. No one knew what it meant, but it was lost because no one was studying it and it was gone. So luckily, at a quarry, this stone was found. And this stone unlocked the ancient Egyptian language. Because what was on this stone? You had a stone that was the same thing translated into 3 different languages. You had Greek on the bottom, you had Demotic in the middle. Demotic is an ancient Egyptian writing style, but it's closer in time to Greek and Phoenician and all these things than it was to Metanetia. So this was what regular people used to communicate at later periods in ancient Egyptian history. So the Greek and the Demotic, you could read the Demotic. People could read the Demotic, and they understood that Demotic and the Greek were saying the same thing. So when they figured that out, they said, oh, then that means the top level must be saying the same thing as the bottom 2. This was used to decode ancient Egyptian language of Metanetia, the writing of Metanetia. When this happened, 1821 to 1822 is when this was occurring. Now let's zoom out a little bit. What's going on in the world in 1821, 1822? African people are still being taken from the continent to enrich the Americas. They're being taken to Brazil. They're being taken to Jamaica. They're being taken to the United States. They're being taken to Canada because slavery's not over in Canada for another 12 years. All of this oppression of African people is based off the myth we talked about a little bit last week that Black folks have no history. They have no culture. They're essentially a step up from apes. This is all the lies that are told to justify chattel enslavement. And then we'll later go on to justify the colonization of Africa. You can colonize these people because, well, they have no civilization. So you're not harming anything. You're making these people useful by pushing them into the mines or putting them on plantations or having them build railroads or extracting their resources because they're not doing anything with them anyway. That was the thinking. But yet, this is discovered right in Africa, in Northeast Africa. So what do you do with this? Because on the one hand, you're saying there's no African history, there's no African culture, they've contributed nothing to humanity. And now you have this with all this evidence of what these folks did. Oh, but wait a minute. These aren't Africans that did this. Exactly. Some Aryans from a long time ago came in, built this, and then left. That was a Western Asian, somebody, anybody. And now it's even aliens. Anybody but Africans. That was anybody but Africans. ABA. Anybody but Africans. But African people knew better because they're also seeing this. Because once this is deciphered, Egypt becomes the rage everywhere. It's Egypt mania in France, in England, in the United States. Everybody wants to learn about it because it's like we're unlocking this part of human history that was lost. And now we can learn things. People are thinking, well, maybe in these ancient hieroglyphics, there's things that could tell us about the future, and maybe there's healing medical things in here, and all types of spiritual stuff. People thought this was going to be a new renaissance once we unlock this. It turned out to be true. There's a lot of things in there, but it became a mania. In the 20th century, Cheikh Diop reminded us when he wrote in his book, The African Origin of Civilization, because this is, again, where a lot of these things about we got to take Egypt out of Africa, it's not African civilization. The more evidence they found, the more they tried to, separate. Well, Diop, again, we talked about his contributions in the 20th century, but he writes, ancient Egypt was a Negro civilization. The history of Black Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it with the history of Egypt. In particular, the study of languages, institutions, and so forth cannot be treated properly. In a word, it will be impossible to build African humanities, a body of African human sciences, so long as the relationship does not appear legitimate. The African historian who evades the problem of Egypt is neither modest nor objective nor unruffled. He is ignorant, cowardly, and neurotic. Imagine, if you can, the uncomfortable position of a Western historian who has to write the history of Europe without referring to Greco-Roman antiquity and to try to pass that off as a scientific approach. What Jope is reminding us decades later, he's saying, look, there was a concerted effort to take Egyptian history away from African history. African historians can't do that. We can't follow that path. That would be like telling European history without talking about Greece and Rome. You can't do that. Now, here's where we complicate this a little bit. And this is where I get into it with a lot of my other scholars that are in Black studies, that are in African studies, because I differ from a lot of people with this. Everything that Jope is saying, I agree with wholeheartedly. Egypt is a part of African history. But we got some people that go a little bit too far with it, and they present it as if the Nile Valley civilizations were the apex of African history, and that it's imperative that we have to try to tie other things in Africa to the Nile Valley. And you don't necessarily need to do that. I understand where that comes from, though. It comes from what Jope is saying at the bottom of this, the Greek and Latin antiquity. Because we've unnaturally adopted some practices from the way the Europeans structured their academy. European academy, particularly in modern times, everything goes back to Greece and Rome. When you got a degree from a major university in the 19th century, early 20th century, if you didn't speak Greek or Latin, you weren't considered educated. If you went to Harvard or Yale or any of these, Oxford, and you didn't come out speaking Greek or Latin, no one really took your degree seriously, because it was that important for European universities that they have these anchor civilizations, particularly Greece, Rome late, but particularly Greece and Rome. You had to know those things. You need to know all their philosophers. You need to be able to speak the language. You need to know even the poetry, the drama of Greece. You needed to know the political institutions, the political writings of Rome, because they were seen as the anchor civilizations for the rest of Western Europe. You understand those, and then you learn everything else. Even though most of these institutions are taking place with peoples that were subjects of Greece and Rome, particularly Rome. I went to university, I have a master's degree from Oxford, went to Oxford. Oxford is in England. England was one of the last places that became incorporated into the Roman Empire. The basis of that, of true British civilization, is not Rome. It's the Norsemen. It's the Celts. It's these other European groups that you don't really get a lot of attention from at universities. University, you had to learn Greek and Latin. You weren't learning Celtic. You weren't learning the Norse languages, the Vikings and all that, Saxon and all that. That's not what you learned, because that wasn't important to them. It was important for them to attach themselves to Greece and Rome. And that became the model. So when African students and African descendant students went through universities, they're being bombarded with Greek and Roman understandings of the world. You're going to learn these philosophers, you're going to learn these things, and this is what it means to be knowledgeable. But then when Egypt comes on the scene and you realize that it's older than Greece and Rome, that the Greeks in particular talk about their admiration for Egypt and try to connect themselves to philosophers like Thales and Aristotle, say, oh yeah, I studied in Egypt, to kind of solidify who they are. Then it becomes the Africans saying, wait a minute, if Egypt is older and these people are praising it, why don't we just go back to Egypt? That should be the anchor civilization. And that's what many of us did. And we began studying the Nile Valley and trying to find everything. But the problem is, in my humble opinion, I think some of us have overdone it, where we study the Nile Valley so much that we forget about the rest of the continent. We don't learn Bantu languages. We don't learn about what was happening in Central Africa, in West Africa, in Southern Africa, because we become fixated on the Nile Valley. So the position here, the subjective position in this course is the Nile Valley is incredibly important. It's incredibly important, but we shouldn't let it overtake our studies of the rest of the continent as well. We got to have some parity. So just the thing, and again, folks on YouTube will watch this, other folks will watch this, and I know this is a debate that we're having. I'm fine having that debate. That's just the opinion. But here's what. Let me go back a little bit to after the Meta Nature was deciphered. This threw a wrench again in that whole idea that Black folks' humanity, Black folks weren't human and didn't have culture or history. 7 years after it was deciphered, we get David Walker's appeal to the colored peoples of the world. David Walker was a free African living in Boston who wrote a pamphlet, one of the most influential pamphlets in African world history, where he advocated for a violent end to slavery. He wanted Black folks to rise up, and you can't negotiate with these folks. You gotta fight. He said, one of the great quotes from this pamphlet is, would you fault, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially says, would you fault a man for drinking water when he's thirsty? No, of course not. So why would you fault a man for killing a man that's trying to oppress you? It's the same instinct. It's self-preservation. So he's arguing stuff like this in 1829. There is a belief, and his pamphlet went out all over the United States. He died mysteriously. Some people think that white folks killed him. There is even a slither of a belief that his pamphlet may have reached Virginia and got into the hands of Nat Turner. It's only 2 years after this that Nat Turner's rebellion happens in Virginia. But anyway, in the same pamphlet, he writes about ancient Egypt. Because again, it was all the rage throughout Western Europe and the United States. He says, some of my brethren do not know who Pharaoh and the Egyptians were. I know it to be a fact that some of them take the Egyptians to have been a gang of devils, not knowing any better. And they, the Egyptians, having got possession of the Lord's people, treated them nearly as cruel as Christian Americans do us the present day. This is a little thing he threw in. He said, you read your Bible stories and talk about how bad Pharaoh treated the Israelites, but guess what? That's only nearly as cruel as what Christian Americans do to us. See how you put that in there. For the information as such, I would only mention that the Egyptians were Africans or colored people, such as we are. Some of them yellow, others a dark mixture of Ethiopians and the natives of Egypt, about the same as you see colored people in the United States at the present day. So already in 1829, African intellectuals are saying, don't let anybody twist you around. The ancient Egyptians were Africans. The ancient Egyptians were Africans. We see this again with Martin Delany, a couple of decades later, considered the father of Pan-Africanism. Martin Delany from Pittsburgh, he formed a vigilante group to protect Black folks in Pittsburgh from the police. He threatened to kill anybody that came to his house looking for escaped Africans. He migrated to Canada. He even did an expedition into Western Nigeria alongside a Jamaican brother named Robert Campbell, and they negotiated with the king of Abeokuta in Yoruba land so that Africans could migrate to West Africa and be free. And this is before the Civil War broke out. Then he came home and fought in the Civil War. But in between all that, he studied ancient Egypt as well. And he wrote a book called The Origin of Races and Color. Because again, remember, this is all during the time where scientific racism is emerging and the European scientists are trying to say, well, of course, white folks are at the top, then you got yellow people, then you got brown people, and then at the complete bottom, you have Black folks. And this racialized hierarchy. So, the African intellectuals are fighting against this. And he writes, the admission of the hieroglyphic representations to be found on the temples and monuments of Egypt of the advanced status of the Negro race settles at once the controversy and leaves only to be proven the fact that the earliest settlers, builders of the pyramids, sculptors of the sphinxes, and original god kings were Blacks of the Negro race. This is what Delany is writing again, and this was published in 1880, but this is from work that he did a little bit earlier on. This is the principle of ethnology of the origin of races and color with an archaeological compendium of Ethiopian and Egyptian civilizations from years of careful examination and inquiry. So again, African intellectuals, Blyden, born in St. Thomas, family lived in Venezuela, he gets educated in the United States, goes to Liberia, he's in Africa, he teaches in Sierra Leone, he actually becomes a Muslim later on in life. But Blyden visited Palestine and Egypt, and he was another one of these writers that wrote about the place of Egypt in African history. Because again, you have to understand the social context that these men are operating in. A context which says African people have no history. And they're saying, no, we have history, not just in where we come from in Yoruba land and other places, but the epitome of ancient civilizations, the one that you can't deny, Egypt, that belongs to us. That's ours. That's our civilization. So you can know, how can you call us uncivilized when we give birth to civilization? This is the argument that they're making. Even in Haiti, Antonor Furman, the Haitian intellectual, statesman, diplomat, he did some of the early work that Jope would build off of. I don't know if he actually cited Furman, but he did a lot of the things that Jope would later do with more advanced techniques in the later 20th century. Furman conducted his own research, used Egyptology, this emerging film. He used languages. He studied sculptural depictions, belief systems of ancient Egypt, migration patterns, and the study of flora and fauna of ancient Egypt, and used the latest contemporary sources to show that Egypt was connected to the rest of Africa. Great Haitian historian. He also wrote another book called The Equality of Human Races, fighting against European scientific racism that tried to paint Black folks as the bottom of civilization based on these quote unquote pseudosciences and eugenics and all these things. This is the work that was being done by these African intellectuals. All right, so let me take a break for a second and open it up for any questions that folks may have before we get into the actual discussion. Because now, all we've talked about so far is why the Nile Valley is so significant, why Africans had to connect it to the rest of the African continent, some of the early work by these African intellectuals in the 19th century to do so when Egypt became all the rage. So I'm going to stop here for a second, and then I'm going to jump in back into it and actually get into the history of what was actually going on during this time period. So any questions from anybody in here or anybody on the chat? Your question, bro? Oh, question. Do we got the mic? No, okay. Daniel, anything in the chat or any hands?
Yes, David H has his hand up.
David H, go ahead. If you're talking, you might be on mute.
Oh, okay, thank you.
There you go.
I was just wondering, what arguments were they using to counter the scientific research at the time to convince the general populace that people of a darker complexion were not subhuman?
Well, in terms of just Egypt or just in general?
In general.
In general, okay, yeah. No, they would present things very clearly, like individual Black people that did different things in terms of mathematics and sciences. They would use common sense. They would just say, listen, if we were of different species, different things, we wouldn't be able to mate and those type of things. They would use ancient sources that the Europeans had, ancient Greek and Latin sources, which talked about Africans being kings and rulers and looked at in a favorable light. So they would use all of those things. They would use their own examples themselves. They would say, listen, there's nothing that someone like Antonor Furman, who was an incredible intellectual, would go to France and say, look at my career. I'm doing everything that you Europeans are doing, and I don't have any white blood in my body, because that was also another thing that the scientific racists would say. They say, oh, well, any Black person that does something, it must be because of the white blood that they have in them. So when they put up Frederick Douglass or they put up somebody, they say, well, this person has white blood in them, so that's why they're able to succeed. It's not the African. They say, look, I'm a full-blooded African, and I'm able to do this. So these are the type of arguments that they would make. And then with people like Furman and others, they would look at, they would try to use genetics as much as they can to say, look, there's no difference in humans. We all have our faults, we all have this. So they would use philosophical arguments, spiritual arguments, arguments of their success and the contributions of African people. They put all that, and of course, history. They put all of that together to make their arguments against these things.
So at the time, they didn't have a scientific rebuttal?
They did, but not the ones that we had, not the conclusive ones that we had today.
Yeah, well, they didn't have genetics, yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So like they are anticipating that, and I think they're making those arguments, but their ability to prove those arguments wasn't there yet. They were correct without the ability to prove that they were correct. You see what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, because I know, what I read was that there's, for instance, the skull shape, they were using that as a differentiator. So what would be like a counter argument to debunk that wrong premise?
That one, I'm not sure exactly with that one, with the skull one that you're talking about. I don't know what they would use exactly. So I have to get back to because I don't know.
Okay.
That's the most honest way I can say that.
Cool.
Know that
Thank you.
they were right. They just didn't know how to prove that they're right. And again, they're going up against a system that's wrong, but that has power.
Exactly, which is happening today.
Oh, yeah, exactly. There's a whole lot of powerful wrong stuff. Exactly.
Thank
go
you.
ahead, brother. Yeah.
It's more like a foundational level of things, right? If we go back, based on the fact that, again, we have to go back to the foundation of literally everything to see that we created basically, at least, everything, honestly, right? Would you consider the fact that science nowadays comes from a racist point of view?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say all science, but science is intricately connected to power.
Mhm.
And this that we're talking about, this where science and economics and race were all combined in the process of slavery and colonization, the origins and the foundations of it, yes, are incredibly racist. And it took Africans and even just-minded Europeans to try to fight against that. But we still see evidences of it. We still see evidences of it, how science is presented, how science is used, the way people are counted and not counted, the presumptions that we go into scientific inquiry with, what you decide and the paradigms that you decide to use to study people and different things. Yeah, there's race in all of that. Yeah, I definitely would agree with all that. Nothing is neutral in this world anymore.
You're obviously, I guess you're familiar with Dr. Frances Cresswell sings the ISIS papers, I think, and she talks about how racism is not just me calling you a certain slur, but it's a whole system from education to financial to scientific to everything. So I guess my question is, actually, I don't think you necessarily have the full answer because I guess it's subjective, right? But it's how do we counter all that, knowing everything we know nowadays, right?
Yeah, power is the short answer to that. Yeah, knowledge. That's one of those big questions that we'll do at the end. Yeah. But the short answer to that is power. None of this. You can't correct any of this from a position of weakness. No, you gotta have power. And there has been a historic disjunction, disunity, disjointedness between power and justice. They're not aligned. Usually the people that have power operate unjustly, and it's never really aligned. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and we'd like to ask a couple of questions. One, how after the Europeans disallowed the Egyptians the capability and the knowledge to build the pyramids, how do they explain similar construction in places like Chichen Itza in Mexico and Machu Picchu in Peru? And my second question is, I'm wondering how are they dealing with the fact that the youngest person in the entire world to earn a PhD is a Black girl, 17 years of age in Chicago? How do they rationalize that?
Well, I'll answer the second part first. I don't know how they rationalize that, and these examples of African achievement, particularly recently, they're great. I would just put a little caveat on it. I hope those young people are using what makes them great. What makes them excellent is not what they've achieved, but what they will do with those achievements. So I hope those young people that get these degrees, we had the young girl that graduated from U Ottawa, I think she was like 12 or something like that. I hope they're using whatever knowledge they gain to make the world more just and to help their people. That will make them excellent. Just having that information and having these degrees, it shows examples that Black folks can think and do things, and that's great. But they have to have a social commitment to their people to really be excellent. I hope that's what they're doing. One second. The first question, the old myth was the magical Aryans, that there were these Aryans that went around the world building these great things. So whenever an ancient civilization was encountered, oh, these must be the great ancient Aryans that went around doing these things. No one accepts that anymore. And so, new thing is the ancient alien theory, which is so asinine and ridiculous. And the fact that the History Channel even gives it attention just shows you how ridiculous. But American TV is ridiculous, and North American TV is ridiculous anyway. Anytime the Learning Channel is claim to fame as 90 Day Fiance on the Learning Channel, then we're lost anyway. So it's all for entertainment purposes. But the sad thing is, you got folks that believe this stuff. No indigenous people, no African people, no Asian people can possibly have the scientific techniques, the engineering techniques, the ability to administer the labor force to do these things. It couldn't possibly have been them. So yeah, that's the sad thing and the way that it goes. Before I get back in it, let me go to Nana and then back in.
Hi, Professor Clyde. Thank you again for facilitating this conversation. Yeah, I just had a quick question. Like, what do you think of the idea that ancient Egyptians were Coptic or Arab and didn't look like phenotypically like us, like dark-skinned people of African descent, sub-Saharan Africans that you see in Ghana, Nigeria, etc.?
We're going to get into that, particularly today.
Okay.
So, one thing, people need to be very precise when they're talking about ancient Egypt. Because like I said, we're talking about a period of 3,000 years of history when we talk about classical Egypt. So that's not all of Egyptian history. That's just the 3,000 years that we can talk about classical. At the end of that 3,000 year period, you got invasions by people from Western Asia. You got invasions by people from Europe in terms of the Greeks and the Romans, the Turks later on. The Arabs come after this. Well after this is where you have Arab settling of Egypt. After the Prophet Muhammad, we're talking about the 8th century CE, 7th, 8th century CE. So long time. So the modern population of Egypt is incredibly mixed. But so there's that aspect of it. Second aspect, Africa, like I mentioned last week, has tons of genetic diversity. So even in ancient Egypt, you had people that were of lighter skin and darker skin. You had all types of different colors in Egypt. So you had that from the beginning as well. But what people like to conveniently ignore is what we'll talk about, what you'll see today. I don't even have to say anything because I'm going to show you the images. Now, if you can fix your mind to make these images look like a lighter skinned Arab, then be my guest. We'll look at the images and you all can, I don't need this, you have eyes. Like we don't need to do genetic testing. You can just look to see. Now, and particularly, not even today's class, we're going to be talking, you'll see it in today's class. When we get into the New Kingdom, so the later part of this 3,000 year history, the later third of this 3,000 year history, where they have the period with all the scholars agree, the period with the most realistic depictions of particularly the royal families, you don't see what they look like in the period with the most realistic, and it's the later period. So I'll be able to answer that question. But this is a deeply political question because, again, it goes back to this whole idea that Egypt can't possibly be in Africa. Now, we can't get caught up with thinking that the ancient Egyptians themselves had this modern concept of race that we like. So this is a new thing. Back then, the Egyptians were highly nationalistic. So when they talked about we're Egyptians, it was about their culture, it was about their status, and it differentiated them from other people. So they weren't racist, they were nationalistic. So they wanted to separate themselves from Nubians. They wanted to separate themselves from Libyans to the west. They wanted to separate themselves from Asiatics to the east, because for them, Egypt was it. They were the chosen people almost. They didn't use that term, but that's who they were. And it was them against the world. And them included darker skinned people, lighter skinned people, and all types of stuff in between. Because race, people weren't caught up on it the way that we're caught up on it today. And not we, but the way it was introduced, manipulated, and explained by Europeans that wanted to dominate the world during this time. Last one, and then we get back into it.
I was actually more for when I asked a question earlier,
It was a man before, I think it was on the, I think so, with the 12-year-old. And yeah, so I read a book. Well, I read a book. I feel like we all read that book. It's called The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. And he talks about how it's literally just a whole system of mind exploitation of Black students when it comes to academics, right? Where he talks about how like the educational system is just completely flawed. It's just literally merely learn and repeat, right? There's no expansion of the mind or anything like that, right? And number two, like we can only expect our kids to be scouted if we go to white institutions, right? We don't have any Black institutions. The second a kid is out of the ordinary, they get it first before anyone else, right? And they literally guide them, right? So it'd be about starting having our own institutions where we get to make our own decisions, right? And yeah, it's a very good book in general, right? Where it talks about education and how they operate on a very subliminal level, right?
And again, going back to my point, you can have all the knowledge in the world, you can have all the skills and techniques, but if you're not using it for the betterment of your people, what's the point? Hitler was a smart guy. Like some of these people that did horrible things in the world, they're incredibly intelligent folks. But what are you doing with your intelligence? That's key. That's key. What are you doing with your techniques? All right, so let's get into it. We're talking about the Nile Valley, and this river system is incredibly important because if we're looking at it from the perspective of the people in ancient Nubia and in ancient Egypt, this is what the world looked like to them. Because the Nile Valley flows, unlike most rivers in the world, south to north. So their orientation of the world, when they're talking about Lower Egypt, is actually in the north. So this is how they saw the world. Upper Nubia and Lower Nubia were in the south, so further you go into Sudan, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt is in this direction and spilling into the Mediterranean. So this is how they viewed the world. So when we're talking about Upper Egypt, just put in your mind that that's in the south. When we're talking about Lower Egypt, we're talking about the north. Now, going back to what I mentioned with Africa going through these different climate stages, sometime maybe around 5000 BC, that's when the Sahara started to get really dry. And this is where we start to see the beginnings of major civilization. When I say major civilization, these markers, and I even hate really using that term, but what many of us understand to be major. So urbanization, so big cities, recognized political structures, that type of thing, diversification of the economy, those markers of civilization, which again, I'm putting this in quotation marks, but you all understand what I'm saying. So what happens? Pastoralists, agriculturalists, when things start to get tight, and we see this even now in 2024, when things start to get tight with the environment, rain stops falling, grass starts drying up, turning to desert, people start to get a little itchy and a little antsy, and conflicts often occur. Pastoralists looking for land to herd their animals, agriculturalists looking for land to maintain, to grow their crops, and when there's not enough land, people start coming into conflict. First, pastoralists start coming into conflict with each other over grazing rights and cattle rustling. That's when you steal cattle from other people and all that, which causes conflict, which causes people to become militarized. Young men's groups start to arise so that they can protect their cattle from other people, and society starts to look like this. And then when they're straight, then they start going after the agriculturalists because they want land for their animals. The agriculturists like, no, I'm trying to grow wheat. Get your donkeys and your sheep and your get out of here. So this causes people to start to butt heads. And you see this place is really narrow. You got desert on both sides of the Nile River. But the beautiful thing about the Nile River, what made Egypt a breadbasket for the ancient world, was the annual flooding of the Nile. The annual flooding of the Nile. This happened like clockwork around this time of the year, around August, actually. The Nile River, as it flowed from south to north, would bring minerally rich waters coming down from the slopes in Ethiopia, down the river, down through Sudan, through Egypt, and emptying out into the Niger Delta in the Mediterranean. So every year the Nile would flood, and when the floods would recede, the soil would be renewed, and it would be incredibly productive for agriculture on both sides of the Nile River. So people started taking advantage of that, and they started to really establish cities based off this agriculture. And then you still have some pastoralists there as well. The conflict starts to happen. The pastoralists start encroaching on the land of the agriculturalists. Things start to occur. Warlords emerge. People that are strong enough to organize. And these starts as family groups. So we go from family to clan to nation. That's typically the progression that we have in terms of how anthropologists understand human civilizations. We go from families, then different families that share the same ancestor form a clan. Those different clans might possibly form a nation. We kind of see what this happening. So the current understanding, what anthropologists think happened based off the archaeological evidence, based off the other forms of burials and things like that, the pastoralists come into the Nile Valley and they basically kind of take over. They're more martial, they're more organized militarily, and they take over. And eventually they're able to form these communities where the agriculturalists provide. They can't keep up the pastoral lifestyle the same way they used to, but they're now in charge in terms of the military and even the spirituality. And they convince the people, and I'm not saying this, I don't want to make them seem like they're charlatans, but essentially the religion is based off the fact that the pharaoh, what becomes the pharaoh, becomes that position of the pharaoh, is essentially almost like a god on earth that is endowed with the ability to maintain order. And all of order in ancient Egypt is based off of this annual flooding of the Nile, this yearly event that leads to order in the land. And this becomes a key principle in Egyptian philosophy, political organization, and spirituality. This idea of ma'at, of order, of balance, reciprocity. And it's the pharaoh's job, the leader's job, to maintain ma'at, both order among people, order among nature, and or even cosmic order. That's the job of the pharaoh. So when things get out of order, it's the pharaoh's fault. We're going to talk about regicide a little bit later on. That's when the people say, all right, well, things aren't in order. We've been giving you all this surplus. You got to go. Because obviously other gods aren't happy with what you're doing, so they'll take you out. Regicide happened in ancient Egypt. People killed the king, killed the pharaoh because they weren't doing what they're supposed to do. But their job was to maintain order, and it was people's job to maintain order. You had to maintain order within yourself as an individual. So it became a key philosophical concept throughout the Nile Valley, particularly in ancient Egypt. The opposite of this is isfet, chaos or disorder. So you got order on one hand, and you got chaos and disorder on the other. They want to avoid that because if the Nile Valley does, the river itself is this manifestation of Ma'at. It has to flood in a certain way. If it floods too much, it could wash out your crops, it could destroy things, there'll be famine. If it doesn't flood enough, the soil won't get enough nutrients, you'll have famine. So it has to flood just enough. So they started taking yearly measurements of the levels that the river would flood, because that flooding would then create irrigation, and people would, create their fields, and they would delineate who owned what. All of this is based off this annual flooding of the Nile. So it leads to things like writing, record keeping, new religious ideas. All of this emerges as a result. So while all this is happening, again, we're talking about between 5,000 and 3,000 BCE, cities are emerging and warlords are emerging. And these warlords want to take advantage of the situation. They want to control the region. And they start to become really interested in luxury items as well. To the south, in Nubia, you have gold, you have animal skins, you have all these things. And coming from Western Asia, you also have luxury goods coming over the Sinai Peninsula into the Niger Delta. There's trade routes that are emerging. So even back then, 5000 BCE, you have trade that's going on. Trade going as far into Asia as Afghanistan. There are burials in ancient Egypt from 3000 BC where there are Afghan minerals that you can only find in Afghanistan that were precious stones that were found in ancient Egyptian burials. Why? Because there were trade networks. And people wanted these luxury items. And then people wanted to control these trade routes. So you got everyday people that are just growing their food, taking care of their animals, doing things. But then you have ambitious warlords that start out as clan heads or family heads. And they say, you know what? If I get my boys together, we could take over this city and I could be the big boss. And then we could take over this. And then we could take over that. And then I could take over more. Because there's always people like that. Ancient Egyptian history is no different from the history of any other people in the world, where you got people that rise up that want to be the boss, that want to be in charge, that want power, that seek power. And this is how it emerges. Now, after these people die and they establish a civilization, then we valorize these people. Oh, this is the founder of this great civilization. We do it with Shaka. We do it with Sunni Ali. We do it with so many of these other empire builders, Sundiata, Keita. But these things aren't voluntary for the most part. Now, some of these political relationships were voluntary. You got people that get together and they say, all right, for mutual protection, we'll form a city, we'll form a community, we'll form a nation. But much of this conquering was not voluntary. So let's talk about the Old Kingdom. Let me get some period. So what we're really talking about, and I didn't mean for this to be animated so much. We're talking about a period from 3200 BCE to 2900 BCE. This is the Archaic period. This is the proto-dynastic period where we start to get the archaeological record of what was going on in terms of nation building in ancient Egypt. And we're also going to talk about the Old Kingdom, which lasted from 2900 to around 2200 BCE. And we'll talk about the first intermediate period. For comparisons, China's first dynasty starts around this time, maybe about 200 years later. But the Great Wall isn't built for another 2,000 years. In India, the Vedas aren't written till around the Middle Kingdom period, and Greece enters its Archaic period around 900 BC. So just understand the difference when we talk about timeline. Before we even realized the Greeks could write, before Homer wrote the Iliad and all that stuff, that happens around 800 BCE. That's 2,000 years later, almost 2,500 years later from what we're talking about today. So I need you to understand that. So ancient Greeks start to emerge. If you look at the timeline from where we're at, and this is the stat I always love to point out, like Cleopatra VII, the last independent ruler of ancient Egypt, is closer to us in terms of timeline than she was to the building of the pyramids. So understand that. So when we talk about how ancient Egypt, that's what we're talking about. All right, so I want to talk about the direction that this goes. And it goes from south to north. When we talk about the establishment of Egypt as a united kingdom, it goes from the south to the north. Now, the traditional dividing line between Egypt and Nubia is the first cataract. So right where you see that, the word Aswan, this is where you have the typical division between what's Nubia and what's Egypt. It's called the first cataract of the Nile River. Around this region is where you start to see in the archaeological record the emergence of some of the earliest kings in Upper Egypt or Southern Egypt. These are to be the kings that would eventually take over the entire thing and unite it. Before the unification of Egypt, you essentially had 42 city-states along the Nile River on both sides. And people lived there. They practiced their own religions. They might have had a united language, but they had different things going on. And eventually someone's going to come along and unite all 42 of these sapats. These are the ancient city-states. Eventually, once Egypt is united, these formerly independent city-states would still maintain some of their regional character, and even their rulers would be allowed to stay as governors. So you're no longer the king of the city-state anymore. You're now the governor of the city-state, and you answer to the pharaoh. But there's a process to see how that all started. One of the earliest pieces of evidence that we have is the Nag el Hamad Dulab tableau. This is the name for the Arab name for the place that is at now. We don't know the actual name of this when it was done. But it shows us something very interesting. And this is one of a number of scenes in this rock art. You see it here, you see a boat. It's kind of hard to make out, but if you look in the bottom right corner, you see some human figures there. This one is kind of a little clearer. You see these boats, because the Nile River, again, was being used for transportation. The kings would, these emerging kings would collect taxes and tribute along the river using these boats. So it was almost like a naval presence. The king's procession would come down, collect things. And you see very clearly in this rock art, one of the earliest representations of a king. And there's some very interesting things in there. The king has a dog, and this dog is really going to be present a lot later in Egyptian iconography. But at the time, this dog was present. You see the king, you see, actually, this is a better version of it. You see somebody carrying a fan. You see some people, standard bearers in front of the king, so they're holding his standard, and there's two, so that means this king probably controls two different cities. So we're seeing the emergence of royalty and the emergence of a unified kingdom in Egypt, because these warlords are taking over city after city. Yes?
Those 42 cities.
Is that the reason why they called it the 42 laws of Ma'at?
It probably has some relation.
Yeah.
It probably has some. I wouldn't be surprised, because they don't usually do things by accident.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised. If you notice the figure that's the king, what is the king holding? The king is, first off, they have the crown of Upper Egypt. That conical shape there is a crown. It's a crown of Upper Egypt. That's going to be a crown of Upper Egypt for the next 1,000 years. It's a white crown. It's kind of cone-shaped. And the king also has a scepter, and you see the king with these other people. One of the things we're going to notice in Egyptian art as the years go on, and as these pharaohs become more and more powerful, these figures start to be represented a lot larger in the artwork, to show that the pharaoh is much more important than regular people. So he gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But at this time, he's only a little bit bigger than the other people. Just a little bit bigger than the other people. But eventually, it's going to get a lot bigger. So all of this action is taking place in these towns like Nagada, Heracleopolis, which is a Greek name for the Egyptian name, the town of Abydos. These are where these large these warlords are starting to consolidate their power in Upper Egypt. They're taking over cities, they're forming political alliances through marriage, all these things. And a lot of this we know, again, through the archaeology, like depictions such as this, the tombs. We're starting to see social inequality from the tombs. Royals are buried with a lot more material items. And some of the kings practiced a tradition that would be practiced in Africa all the way up until the 20th century, where when the king died and there's an afterlife, the king needs some people to go ahead and service him in the afterlife. So if you were the king's butler when he was alive, you're going to be the king's butler when he's dead. So we're going to kill you and bury you with the king, because I'm going to go in the afterlife with no servants. And I say this was done all the way up until the 20th century. I was just reading a book. There was an African-American missionary and explorer named William Shepherd, who was the first outsider to visit the one of the kingdoms in what will become the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was the Luba Kingdom. I think it was the Luba Kingdom. And when he gets there, well, first off, when he gets there, the king looks at him and says, "You look like one of the previous kings that we had." So they thought he was an ancestor returning from the dead. And he was honored as such. And he tried to tell them that, no, I'm not, but they didn't believe him. They said, "Oh, you just forgot. You died and you forgot, and now you came back, but you're one of us." So they allowed him. They didn't let white missionaries come, but they let him come. They said he's a returning ancestor. But anyway, when he's there and he's observing the kingdom, he loves most of the things that he sees. And he's, going to Congo at a time where, again, the understanding is Africans have no civilization. They have no great kingdoms. They have this. And he's like, I'm right in the middle of it. And I'm seeing this. I'm seeing this grandeur. I'm seeing this political organization. I'm seeing how these people dress, how they operate, the rituals they have. And he loves most of it until he witnesses a funeral and someone says, well, you know, one of the queens just died. So she's going to be buried along with about 20 other attendants. We're going to go ahead and bring them. She's going to bring them with her. And he's like, wait a minute, you're going to just kill these people? Yeah, what do you mean? Yeah, we got to kill these people. She needs people to work for her in the afterlife. So we see that in ancient Egypt as well during this time. When some of the kings would die, you got to go with them. Now, eventually, they would stop this practice because people realized that, well, if these people were talented at what they did, we might want to keep them around. We don't have to train new people, but that comes later on. So anyway, one of the first warlords we have on record. Now, he's not the first Egyptian king. The first king that we have on record is a guy by the name of Iri-Hor, I-R-Y-H-O-R. It's the first, one of the first names, personal names that we have in world history. And he was a king in Upper Egypt. Iri-Hor, I-R-Y-H-O-R. But this is one of the first ones that we know ruled a good amount of territory. Now, his name is King Scorpion. And we know his name is King Scorpion because there's a little scorpion next to his face. That represents this is his name. And you see he has the same crown that you saw here in this tableau. So he's a few decades after this guy who we don't know who it is. It might even be a woman. We don't know who this ruler is. But we know King Scorpion. He is responsible for uniting Upper Egypt. He conquered all of those city-states in the southern part of Egypt. And this is on a ceremonial mace head. A mace. A mace is essentially it's a weapon. It's a ball, a stone ball at the end of a stick. You use it to bash people's heads in. So again, this is not some type of peaceful, oh, come on everybody, let's just join one kingdom. No, Scorpion went about, and you can see from the mace head what he was up to. You see how big he is now. You see the attendants are smaller and how large this king is. He's not a pharaoh yet. He's just a king. He's the king of Upper Egypt. But he has a prisoner that he's about to smite right there. This becomes a common motif among the pharaohs. You even see how the pharaoh is shown. He's in shape. He has muscles, you know, in his legs. Look at his calves. He's been working out his calves a lot. You know, look at his shoulders. The pharaoh is a striking figure. That is a warlord that commands people to be in this new order that he is creating. We talk about new orders, new world orders, and order becomes a key element of Egypt because they want to maintain order. So King Scorpion sets this up. But he only takes control of everything that you see in red, all these red numbers. This is Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt are these city-states around the the Nile River Delta. When the Nile fans out into the Mediterranean, there were a bunch of city-states up there. That's Lower Egypt. So he takes control of Upper Egypt. And again, this is important in terms of African history because it was presumed that Egyptian civilization came from Western Asia from outside in. But all the evidence is showing no, it came from the south near Nubia up, down the Nile. And that's how it went. So, but I'm gonna go a little bit faster just for the sake of time. The first pharaoh, the first person to unite the two lands, Lower and Upper Egypt, was a man by the name of Narmer, who the Greeks called Menes. Narmer actually means catfish. So these early pharaohs have these animal names, these fierce animals, scorpion, catfish. You're gonna think catfish, they're not dangerous. If you've seen the Nile catfish, they're ferocious animals. It's a good name for a king. Sad part is, going to the end, we have the evidence of Narmer's death. And he didn't die any like glorious death in battle or in old age. A hippo knocked over his boat and killed him. And hippos kill more people in Africa today than any other animal. So that's how he died. So that's how we know he's a historical figure, because no one's just going to make up. If you're going to make up somebody, they're going to die a valiant death. He got killed by a hippo. That's some random, we know he's real. But anyway, this is called the Narmer palette. It's a ceremonial palette, and it shows the history of him uniting the two lands. And there's a lot going on it. This is one side of it, and this is the other side of it. On this side, you see the Pharaoh holding a mace, holding a prisoner, and you can guess what's about to happen next. The Pharaoh got this guy, and he's about to smite him. And you see underneath the Pharaoh's feet 2 other enemies that are being trampled by the Pharaoh. And you see the god Heru approving all this. Heru becomes the god of kingship. Heru is approving all of this, represented by the falcon. You see on this side, now on this side of the palette, he's wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, that conical crown, the white crown of Upper Egypt. On this side, you see the Pharaoh, and he's wearing the crown of Lower Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, leading a processional. And if you can make it out, and it's kind of blurry, but if we zoom in on the top right corner on this side of the palette, you see these figures, and there's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's about 10 of these figures that are decapitated with their heads between their legs. If you can make, that's what that's showing. It's kind of clearer on this one. Look in the top right corner. You see those figures? Their heads are cut off and they're between their legs, meaning he conquered these people. And it's believed that they represent the various towns that he conquered. And you see his flag bearers, and they're holding up these standards of these other towns that he's conquered along the way. Those folks carrying the big poles with the standards on them. Each one of these towns had their own flag and standard. So you see, he's a conqueror. And this isn't, again, it's not voluntarily. People didn't voluntarily get their heads chopped off and put between their legs or get smited. No, he had to actually conquer this territory. So he does it. And he establishes the first dynasty, the first family to rule over Egypt. And in the Old Kingdom, we would have somewhere between 10 and 11 dynasties or different families that would control Egypt. Every time the family switched, a new dynasty would be created. But he's the first. He's Narmer, the first unifier, the first Per'ah, or great house. Pharaoh means great house, the first person to wear the 2 crowns. And in fact, for the rest of Egyptian history, Egypt would always be referred to as the 2 lands, because it was this understanding. It's like, we don't just have Trinidad, it's Trinidad and Tobago. You got 2 lands, you got 2 places. So that was important. He wore the upper crown and lower crown together, the double crown, to represent the unification of the 2 lands. Again, this idea of ma'at, balance, upper, lower. He controls all of that. So, and this is the other piece of evidence that we have for Narmer. This is called the Narmer mace head. Again, you see a lot of these ceremonial items are on mace heads, these weapons. So this is a martial society. This is a society where the pharaoh is a warlord. It's someone that can maintain order through violence if necessary. This one shows his marriage to one of the princesses in Lower Egypt. You see he's wearing a crown of Lower Egypt, and he's getting married. This is solidifying his rule that you see there. So after he's gone and these dynasties emerge and Egypt is under one ruling pharaoh, those folks that ran those city-states, they still get to be in charge on a local level, but they got to kick the taxes up to the pharaoh. So the pharaoh's getting the lion's share of the taxes. Some of it's going to the local areas. You got local nobility and the like. And they still have control over their local areas just as long as the taxes go to the pharaoh. So it's not as centralized as you would think. It's going to get more centralized later on. Anyway, we have an interesting figure in the first dynasty, in the first family that's ruling Egypt. All the way back in 2900 BCE, we have Per'ah Merneth. Per'ah is the actual term for pharaoh. It means great house. So that's the title, the Per'ah Merneth. Merneth is the first woman in recorded history to be the ruler of a nation. And we have her name. This happens in Africa before it happens anywhere else in the world. 2900 BCE, you in the first dynasty. So it's not like Africans were debating, can women rule or should women be allowed to rule nations and all that. The first dynasty, you have a woman running this kingdom that's probably one of the more powerful in the world at this time. All these 42 city-states, all the administration that it takes to run that, there's a woman that's in charge. And her name is Merneth. Really important that we recognize that. Because when we look at Africa today, we got 55 countries, I think 1 female head of state at this point. So important to point that out. All right. Also, in the Old Kingdom, in the first couple of dynasties, we have the emergence of these monumental building projects. The first major one is the step pyramid. This was a joint effort by Pharaoh, the Greeks called Joseph, actual name Net-Jeriket, Net-Jeriket, who the Greeks called Joseph, and his right-hand man, Imhotep. Now, prior to Joseph, when the Pharaoh died, the Pharaoh would be buried in a tomb that looked like this. It's a rock building. The Pharaoh would be buried underneath, and it was called a project, a house of eternity. This is where the Pharaoh's body would be laid. You see how it looks. The Arabs would call this a mastaba because it looked like a bench. The Arabs called it a mastaba, but it's called a project. Well, Joseph comes around, and Joseph is living in a time where the surplus is great. So the taxes are coming up. There's a lot of diversification. The government can hire scribes. The government can hire builders. There's a lot of wealth going on. And he says, I want to take it another step further. I don't want just a regular project when I die. I want something different. So he goes to his man Imhotep. And Imhotep was a multi-genius. Imhotep, when he died, would actually become deified because of his brilliance. He was a mathematician. He was a medical doctor. He was an architect. And he was essentially kind of like a prime minister. He kind of like ran government. So he did a lot of different things. He was the Pharaoh's right-hand man. So Joseph said, Imhotep, design me something that no one has ever seen. And Imhotep said, I got you. We're going to create the biggest building in the world. And it will be the biggest building in the world until another Egyptian pharaoh decided to build something bigger. And again, this is 2600 BC. So you have to imagine the bureaucratic skill that it took to get all of these people together, get all the resources to design, to build. You see what it takes to build these buildings around here without all the modern machinery and all the skill that it would take. And the fact that this was a government project. So let's clear up something else before we go any further in ancient Egyptian history. Because I know many of you first introduced to Egypt, because most people watching this are Muslims, Christians, or they come out of Abrahamic religions. So the first time you're usually introduced to Egypt is with the story of Moses and the Exodus. And we get it in our minds that these things were built by slave labor. Not true. Exploited labor, yes, but not slave labor. What happened in ancient Egypt? You could pay taxes in a number of ways. You could pay taxes with your goods, so if you were a farmer or if you raised animals, you give a portion to the government, that type of thing. You could also pay your taxes with labor. So the government would force people to pay their taxes in labor. So you got to spend a certain amount of time on the job site. But they also employed artisans and craftsmen that did the more delicate things, the stone cutting and some of these other things. This was done by people that were actually employed by the state to do so. So the taxes that people would pay would go to pay craftsmen and artisans that would do these things. But the actual labor, lifting things and moving things, that was done by people in the form of paying their taxes. So was it exploited labor? Yes, the state forced people to do that, but they weren't slaves. There's a difference. There's a big, big difference. So even if you read the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, which most people don't, they're not even called slaves. They're servants. They're laborers, because that's what people did. So anyway, we'll get to that later, but I just want to point that out. So this was done as a government project. This is a government-funded project. So Imhotep and Joseph. Now, again, going back to our discussion about race, this is Joseph. This is 2600 BCE. If you look at this image, you can still see the coloration on Joseph. This is dark brown paint. Now, if Joseph looked anything else, why would he color himself like that? Look at Joseph's lips. Look at his cheekbone. I mean, you have eyes. Yeah, when those things happen, so that's another thing. And those things happen. But yeah, what does his nose look like? We'll see that. But anyway, the step pyramid. But he wasn't the only, these aren't the only types of people or the pharaohs. You also have noblemen and women that left records behind. And I like to talk about this guy, Metgen. He's just a government official. But he died, was buried, and he left a record about who he was. And this kind of gives us an understanding about regular, everyday people. Now, he was more of an upper class person, but he wasn't royalty. You know, he just talks about his life. He says, you know, the property of his father, the judge and scribe, Impunak, was given to him without wheat and barley and the property of the estate, but with dependents and herds of donkeys and pigs. And then his whole life, he was promoted to the first of the scribes of the office of provisioning, an overseer of the officer of the office of provisioning. He was promoted to be the strong voice among those involved in agricultural production, meaning he might have been some type of union official. So people, the farmers elected him to speak for them and for government. When the boundary official of the sixth nome of Lower Egypt was in charge of the, all of this. But I put this up here because it talks about how this man saw himself and what he wanted to write about his life and the different positions that he held in government. This just sounds very familiar to people that lived in Ottawa. It's like his LinkedIn page. Yeah, I worked here, and I got promoted to this job. Then I got promoted to this job, and I worked for the government. And this was his life. And I put that out there to say, when you think about this, this is 2600 BCE, almost 5,000 years ago, where you had all these different jobs, and people administering different things, having different positions, a diversified economy. This is not some, just rinky-dink kingdom. This is a well-structured government with bureaucracy, with officials, with people that are able to use all of the talents of the people that are in the kingdom. Really important. And you can see his nappy afro. Again, just want to point out things like we'll talk about it. Let's talk about the grandeur of the Great Pyramids at Giza and the Sphinx. This is all in the Old Kingdom. This is the first few dynasties. This is the fourth dynasty. This is the fourth family that have taken over since Egypt has unified. This is only about 500 years after Narmer. Very short amount of time. And now they're already building some of the greatest monuments on this earth, because they're the only ancient wonders of the ancient world that are still up. All the other ones are down. It's the oldest, and it's the one that's still up. A very important thing. So if aliens come to Earth and they talk about what's the greatest thing that you created, they'll probably point to this. We should probably point to this. These were the builders of the pyramids: Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. And it's really interesting because when you look at this picture, it looks like that one in the middle is the biggest, but it's actually not. The one further back is the biggest. It was built by his father. Khufu built that first one. It's the one all the way in the back. But his son came along, Khafre, and said, yeah, I want my pyramid to look bigger than my dad's. So he built it on a higher platform. So it looks bigger than his dad's, but it's not. But it's amazing because somebody a couple of years ago, they asked me to talk about Black fathers to a group of people. And I said, there's no greater monument to the power of Black fatherhood than the pyramids of Giza. This is a father, son, and grandson that built these. And they're still up. It's still up. Like, it's just amazing that one of the greatest monuments in the world is something that father. So, don't think about LeBron playing with his son as just the greatest thing that a father and son ever did. This is the greatest thing that a father and son ever did. And again, look at Khafre. I don't need to say more. I mean, just look at it. Look at Menkaure. Menkaure looks like he looks like there's a comedian by the name of there's two of them. They're brothers. I can't think of their names right now. It's escaping me. But he looks like them. I mean, we don't. Again, you got eyes. But anyway, let me go further because I know I'm going over time.
Is it the Wayne brothers?
Not the Wayans brothers. No, it's these two brothers. They were real popular in the 90s. One of them was in Poetic Justice. I'll think of it later. But anyway, I'll think of it later. But anyway, the fourth dynasty was when those pyramids were built. The Sphinx was built. All those things. The fifth dynasty was relatively strong. Things start to fall apart between the sixth and the 10th dynasties. So every time a dynasty changes, remember, this is when a new family takes over, either through a military coup or something happens. There's a change in the families that rule Egypt. By the time we get to the 6th and 10th dynasty, a couple of things start to occur. Number one, there's some problems with the flooding of the Nile. There's some climate change, some climate situations happening, and a little disorder is creeping in, and the people at the bottom are saying, wait a minute, the Pharaoh, you're supposed to be responsible for maintaining natural order, and there's a lot of famine going on. We're starting to lose faith in the Pharaoh as someone that's actually responsible for maintaining this order. So there's starting to be a little bit of a crumbling of faith. It's kind of like the American political system right now. People don't believe in the leaders. So that starts to happen. And then on a local level, we go back to these city states. There's rebellions against central authority. Some of the nomarchs or these regional governors are saying, why should we listen to the Pharaoh again? I can just raise my own, because there's no standing army in Egypt at this time. So whenever there was a conflict or something happened, the governors would raise troops for the Pharaoh, then all those troops would unite and they would go do something, whether that was going into Western Asia or going into Nubia in the south. That's how armies were raised. And then when the campaign was over, people go back to work as farmers, as craftsmen, whatever. So some of these nomarchs, these governors start thinking, I'll just raise my own army and try my luck and fight against the system, maybe become independent again. And so you start to see a lot of that happen. Eventually, we get to the point where Egypt breaks down again into two different nations. You got one family ruling in the north and one family ruling in the south. The family in the south sets their capital at a city called Waset. And it's really interesting because this family in the south, they have allied themselves with one of the spiritual systems in Waset that's led by a god. I'm going to go through this really quickly. A god by the name of Amun or Amun-Ra. Now, prior to this, remember I said each one of these city-states had its own flag and all this before the unification, and they all had their own religious symbols. And these would be united into this great pantheon of Egyptian deities. But there was a top deity, and the top deity was the deity at Memphis, which was the capital that the first pharaohs established as the capital of Egypt. It was right in the middle between the two lands, city called Memphis. And the god there was a god by the name of Ptah. Ptah, P-T-A-H, Ptah. Ptah was the god of Egypt. So there's God, and then there's other deities. Ptah was God. Ptah was represented as a mound. You know, kind of when the Nile River would flood and then recede and you start to see the land come up out of the water again, that mound was called Ptah, and that was the representation of God. Because remember, they relied on the Nile, receding and all that for their crops. So Ptah was God. Now, with this new family coming out of Thebes, Thebes had a god named Amun, Amun-Ra. Amun was the hidden god, a god that represented all of creation. And this god is going to become the new god. It's going to supplant Ptah as the god. Now, Ptah is still going to be around, but Amun-Ra is the big god and will remain the big god for the rest of Egyptian history. But anyway, actually, no, there's a brief period that we'll talk about where he's not, and we'll get into that next week. So this pharaoh by the name of Ptah-Menhotep, he's the one that reunites Egypt. And this whole period where you have these weak pharaohs and these nomarchs, I think that they can run things and all this disunity, it's called the first intermediate period. The first intermediate period. And this is where there's no strong pharaoh, there's no central government in Egypt. And things are seen as kind of like disorderly, at least from the perspective of the pharaoh. Now, for everyday people, it's really not that bad. I mean, aside from the fact that there's periodic famine and things like that. But when there's no strong pharaoh, the taxes ain't going to be collected like that. So you keep more of your money. So the disorder thing is in the eye of the beholder. So from the pharaoh's perspective, all this disorder, and this really sparks off again in the second intermediate period. We have a little bit more literature about this. But during this time, the regular people are kind of like, wow, nobody's collecting the taxes. I can keep more of my stuff. Good. But Menhotep puts an end to all that. Menhotep comes up from the south and essentially does a redo of Narmer. He comes back and reconquers the rest of Egypt and unites it, and he starts the Middle Kingdom. His family starts the Middle Kingdom. One of his names becomes he who makes the heart of the two lands to live, because he reunited Egypt. Again, you see him here, pictured here, with the white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt. And again, just look at him. Just look at him. We don't have to have a whole lot of conversation about what he looks like, because you all have eyes. So you can just look at it. And then here are his wives. One of his wives, Queen Kawit, and another one of his wives, Queen Kimsit. These are the two images of his wives, two of his wives that he had. We have from their tombs, and you can kind of see what they're doing. She's getting her hair done and sipping on something and probably having a good time. That looks like a good time. That she's just chilling and getting her hair done. And the other wife, two different wives, you know, she's chilling, drinking something, having a good time. But again, just look at them. You see what they look like. You've seen this image if you've been in a black beauty salon or anywhere. You've seen what this looks like. You can imagine them gossiping and having a good time. So this is the family that took over. That would start the 11th dynasty. That would start the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom doesn't get a lot of attention, but we're going to spend time talking about it next class. We're going to talk about the Middle Kingdom. We're going to talk about the New Kingdom, and we're going to talk about Nubia next week. So I'm going to end it there before we get into this period of ancient Egyptian history and history of the Nile Valley. So I'll stop there today. Again, I encourage everybody to read chapter 2 in the Shillington text. Look at the other videos and articles and book chapters that are on our course website for more information about various things I talked about, more in-depth information. You can actually read some of the studies. You can read about the pharaohs like Nearneth and Narmer and Djoser and Imhotep. There's a lot of articles on Imhotep. So yeah, we'll stop there for the day. We'll open it up for any questions, comments, community announcements, that type of thing. I think I see, Daniel, any hands, anything in the chat first off, before we go to hands?
The only thing in the chat says was the name of the comedian Joe Torre.
Yes, the Torre brothers, Joe and Guy Torre. He looks like Guy Torre. Mankari looks like Guy Torre. Someone Google Guy Torre and Mankari kind of looks like. Yeah, the Torre brothers. Thank you. David H. Then will go in here.
Thank you, Dr. Ledbetter. Awesome class as your typical. I was curious about the term king and using the term king to equate with a pharaoh. Is it possible that the term king, because it comes so much later in its origins, is too narrow a term to capture all the attributes that a pharaoh is actually representing?
I think you can make that argument, definitely, because and yeah, that's a good thing to point out. It's not so much, we're going to really see it in the Middle and New Kingdom, particularly when that when the pharaohs that worship Ammon come in. But the pharaoh was also a religious figure as well. So just as quickly as I could have called him a king, I could have called him a pope as well, because it's even more than a pope. Because the king was the literal embodiment of cosmic order on earth. So it's not just a political position, it's not just a military position, but it's also a spiritual position that you are in. So yeah, the word king, you're right, it doesn't really encapsulate all of the duties, because you had to do the things kings had to do. You had to be a general, and you had spiritual responsibilities as well. And again, the people are watching all of this. So the minute that you are seen lacking in one of those areas, if it's politically, then you got people that are willing to revolt. You got these different governors, because remember, at this time, we've already had 6 different families. By the time we get to the start of that intermediate period, we've already had 6 different families that have taken over. So we know that there have been changes in government where people are saying this family, for whatever reason, whether it's politically, militarily, or spiritually, they're not up to the task. We got to replace them. And then when they replace them, they have to get the okay of all those other nomarchs to say that, yeah, this works. So there's probably a lot of political intrigue and different things that are happening that if we go into the historical record, we'll be able to see those changes in dynasties occur. But yeah, you had to be strong in all 3 of those elements and show your strength, your spiritual strength. You better make sure that you can't, of course, there's nothing you could do as a human being but pray yourself that the Nile River floods the way it needs to flood and all those things, so that spiritually things look like they're okay. Militarily, you need to do that. And then politically, you got to make alliances. You got to make sure that people are satisfied with your rule and all of that. You have to judge things correctly when things are brought to your attention in terms of conflicts between different gnomes and all that. So yeah, you got to have all three of those elements. So I think that's a good observation. That King is kind of narrow for this, very very much so. Thank you for that.
Awesome. I was also wondering then, is there any evidence then to support the hypothesis that on the stone tablet where the pharaoh is casting, it looks to me like the pharaoh is casting judgment over the men, and they have their heads between their legs. Is it possible? Because that seemed like very obvious to me, a connection that the men were possibly thinking with their little head instead of their big head, and this is why they're getting banished and sent out for judgment.
It's possible. I mean, there's a lot of interpretations for this. One of them that I've seen is that they represent the fallen armies. Each one of them represents a different city in the north that he conquered. And it's just a representation of how thoroughly he conquered them, that he was able to cut their heads off and put them in the position that they're in. So it's not even so much. So I'm not saying this right, but I'm saying this is what the interpretation is, that they are just fill-ins for he conquered this city, this city, this city, this city so easily and decisively that this is what their leaders ended up looking like after it was finished. But they are just fill-ins for all the cities that he conquered. The reason why it's believed is because of what's preceding it. The folks that are holding up these standards of the other places that he's conquered, and the fact that he's wearing the crown of Lower Egypt as well. So I believe from what people said, it's meant to be read this way as opposed to this way. So he's conquered these people. He's now he's the ruler of Lower Egypt. But yeah, there's a lot of symbolism in this and just these two images. Because even here, the what you see in the middle, it's a mythical animal. It's kind of like a combination of a lion and a giraffe, but it's representing the uniting of the two lands. That there, and then you see the bull, the pharaoh represented as a bull on both bottoms of the palette. Well, on the bottom here, trampling his enemies. But here you literally see the pharaoh trampling folks underneath. So yeah, this is a representation of a very violent takeover by Narmer and his uniting of the two lands and bringing order. So he had the ability, he was given the spiritual authority to take over these lands, to create order, to end all the fighting through fighting, which is, a weird way of saying it, but yeah. End all the chaos through fighting, being the most powerful bull in the pen.
All right, thank you.
Go ahead, brother. Oh,
I just have a quick question. The term was it like a title or a name?
It's a title. It means the Great House. So the pharaoh was called the Great House. Yeah, so that per eye title is going to go from 3100 BC all the way up to about, let's see, that would be around 100. Let's see, I got to figure out Cleopatra's years, but it's probably 100 BCE or somewhere thereabouts. Yeah, so it goes a long time, almost about 3,000 years, where that title is the title of who's running Egypt.
And so was it always like the son of the person?
No, because sometimes you had daughters. Most times it was one of the sons, but you had daughters. You had, again, sometimes things change from military coups, so you have a general strong enough to take over. But yeah, we see daughters, we see sons, we see nephews, we see grandsons. And so again, that 3,000-year period, there's a lot of different times it changes. But I like that question because I really want to reiterate to people that Merneptah was the first female ruler, but she's certainly not the last. We have a lot of female pharaohs. And it's like not a thing about gender, about who can control. I mean, you definitely have more men. I don't want to say it was some kind of gender equality situation going on. It definitely wasn't, but it wasn't abnormal to have a female pharaoh. And even the one, we'll talk about it next week, Hatshepsut, that, scholars try to say, oh, the Egyptians were mad because a woman was ruling them. No, that's a European understanding of the history. The pharaoh that succeeded her was mad that his stepmother / aunt took over his position and he wanted her erased. Not because she was a woman, but because he was personally mad at her because she took his position. We'll get into that story because that one, and a lot of these people, they're royal, so, people marry sisters and cousins and all that type of stuff. So we'll talk about it next week. Yeah.
Just more for like the class as well. And again, I don't want to just mess up anyone's perception because I know there's a lot of religious people in there, right? But I think it's important to notice as well, like throughout history, we don't really hear of certain things like heaven or hell or these things. They don't really mention it until a certain time in history, right? And it looks like they really believed more in like reincarnation and stuff that's also been hidden from the Bible as well. I know there's the book of reincarnation and a few other like scriptures that also like press on the matter, right? But it's yeah, as we go, we can just see it like that. They were living a certain way, and they're literally the foundation of almost everything from I think they had those mysteries schooled.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the mysteries. Yeah, it's the foundation of like the philosophy and the magic and all these things, right? But then, yeah, it's as the further we go back, the more we decode all the lies, pretty much, right?
And it's really going to get interesting next week because what we've talked about so far today, with the exception of that guy that I mentioned, there's a few other tombs where people talk about their lives and stuff like that. Most of the history of the Old Kingdom that we have, a lot of it is the upper classes and the royals. When we get to the middle of the New Kingdom, we start to see everyday people's lives, and we also get more literature in the Middle Kingdom, where you have things like the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which the European anthropologists call the Book of the Dead. This is written in the Middle Kingdom, and it talks about these different spiritual elements and things like that. We get a lot more of that literature. We get a lot more of those understandings of how schools worked, what the spiritual system looked like, what the judicial system looks like in the Middle and New Kingdoms, where we got those actual records that we could actually still read. So it gets real interesting. That's why I love the Middle Kingdom. People say, oh, the Middle Kingdom wasn't a lot going on. It's not a lot of pyramid buildings, not a lot of big things like in the New and the Old Kingdom, but there's a lot of literature coming out of that Middle Kingdom that we're going to explore next week. Any other questions? Anything in the chat, any hands, any announcements, things going on that folks want to alert us to? I don't see anything, so we will stop there today. We'll, again, start next week. We'll talk about the Middle, New Kingdom. We'll also talk about Nubia. So keep reading. Again, chapter 2 in Shillington, if you want to read on your own, get more information, use the course website. And yeah, we'll stop there. Thank everybody for participating, and stay safe. We'll talk soon.